WCW vs. nWo World Tour, released by THQ for the Nintendo 64 in 1997, is the first entry in what would be a long line of highly regarded wrestling video games from a time when that form of entertainment was on the verge of hitting its hottest period since Hulkamania was a beloved thing and not, well, you know. I missed out on these back in the day because, well, back in the day, everyone I knew had PlayStations and we stuck with the SmackDown games and whatever offerings came out of the Acclaim camp. It took a while, but once I got myself a Nintendo 64 and also a proper gamepad, I started getting these things whenever I could and started to see what the fuss was all about with all these Aki-developed wrestling games. And yes, each subsequent game released will naturally be superior to the one that came before, and we'll eventually get to those, but like the start of the beginning, so we begin with World Tour. So let's start with the roster, which boasts a rather sizable selection of wrestlers to choose from, about 60-ish I believe, although only a small number of these comprise actual WCW and nWo talent, whether it be Flair, Sting, Hogan, or even fake Sting, with quotations no less to distinguish him from the real Sting. Now, that's adorable. I wonder if fake Sting will be all elite somewhere down the line and we could... Okay, never mind. The rest of the roster comprises either original or non-infringing incarnations of competing wrestlers from rival international promotions, grouped into other original or non-infringing replacements of rival international promotions. The Japanese equivalent of this game, Virtual Pro Wrestling, has a few more wrestlers and a couple extra bits, but we're not touching that game beyond a passing mention just to say that it exists and nobody else has to bring it up. So, yeah. Each wrestler has 4 outfits to pick from, so if you don't care for air guitar playing Hollywood Hogan or Crow Sting, you can go for their more classic looks instead, since that's an option. Doesn't mean anything in the long run, but it's something, and the closest you're getting to character customization here, since that wouldn't be a thing until Acclaim's Warzone would come along, or at least the next game in this run, just to keep it close to home, but we're not. That's the... World Tour has a few modes of play. Your usual one-shot exhibition being an option where you can choose to compete in either a singles match, a tag match, a 2-on-1 handicap match, or a battle royal with up to 4 players, which is not the most varied pool of match types, I'll be honest. There are other modes of play as well. The League Challenge, in which you pick a wrestler and then you pick a league, and then you fight through that chosen league's roster to eventually face off against that league's champion for the right to win a trophy and unlock said champion as a playable character, so you do get a little something more out of it. There is also a WCW vs. nWo mode, which is essentially a series of gauntlet matches pitting a team of 5 WCW wrestlers against a team of 5 nWo wrestlers, and whichever team manages to eliminate their opposition wins the battle for brand supremacy, for fuck's sake. Finally, there's a couple tournament modes of either the bracket or round robin variety, which is a relic of the game's Japanese wrestling influence, which is perfect for those Meltzer types who follow the G1 more closely than they probably should, but I digress. World Tour's gameplay is roughly similar to an old game that I played back on the PlayStation called WCW vs. the World. You tap buttons for quick moves, you press buttons for strong moves, and said buttons in conjunction with directional inputs will net you various wrestling moves to use against your opponent. The general idea being that you use quick moves to soften your opponent up, so that when you attempt the big strong moves, they'll be less resistant and take them bumps. You can also block and reverse moves with proper timing, which is worth nailing down, and as you're landing attacks and taunting your opponent, your spirit meter will slowly build until it fills up, and this word special will start glowing, during which time you'll gain some temporary boosts as well as be able to perform your wrestler's signature maneuver. The one thing about World Tour, and to a certain extent the later games in the series, it's not a quick moving game. It's a very slow, very deliberately paced game, and at first glance might seem a bit jarring for first timers, or rather a bit slow. But once you start getting a feel for the controls, the way your wrestlers handles and move about, you learn how matches operate and play out, because you're not just trading blows to build up to a finish, and you hit the finish and it's done in a couple of minutes. You gotta beat the bastard down first before you start hitting the big moves, and then, after a while, your victory starts to feel earned and satisfying. After a while, the game is a breeze to play, and each wrestler has a plethora of moves at their disposal. There's even some double team moves for tag matches and some weapons you could grab from the crowd. which sounds quaint today, but back in the day compared to what came before, this was as close to recreating the product you saw on TV as you were going to get, and the controls were nice, slick, smooth. They just melt in your hands and everything feels natural, even in this somewhat stilted presentation. The overall speed of the gameplay was almost pitch perfect. Doesn't run too fast like the SmackDown games, but not quite the slithering sloth like the Acclaim efforts were at the time. Though if someone were to complain that the game was too slow, I wouldn't hold it against them, but to me, it achieves that nice little balance that if I had played this back in the day, I would have gone for an N64. Hell, I'd even put up with those shit controllers. And those are shit controllers, and I will not believe otherwise. Tag team matches are fun for a lark, and the handicap match is an interesting challenge, especially from the 1 against 2 perspective. Battle Royal is really something special, a play mode where 4 wrestlers can go at it and beat the shit out of each other. It's a match type that seems tailor-made for N64's built-in 4-player capabilities, and certainly a major selling point over its Sony rival, which made you need to buy a multi-tap or something for that sort of thing. Whatever, fuck that noise. So it's safe to say that World Tour isn't exactly the prettiest looking wrestling game out there, which is plainly obvious nowadays, but even by the standards of the time, it's generally average looking fare as far as the character models and their somewhat stiff movement is concerned. With that having been said, however, the models are sufficient representations of the various wrestlers they're supposed to depict, and you can tell them apart. For the most part, if you recognize them. Otherwise, it's all the same shit anyways. But I also like that you could wear the proverbial crimson mask when you bleed someone up and it doesn't look like complete crap. The various arenas are really nothing special, just a ring with a different logo in the middle and slightly animated cardboard audience. Sufficient elements to depict a modest wrestling arena, and the various menus are just there. No entrances, no character-specific music. Not even a cool introductory sequence to open the game. The one they have there is just, it's there. Likewise, the sound department is also somewhat average fare. Anyone coming into this expecting familiar WCW themes or the like will be somewhat disappointed, as you're treated with nothing but the most generic of generic sounding Nippon light rock tunes that are not quite as memorable as the tunes found in the PlayStation exclusive WCW vs. the World. And if you remember any tunes from that game, give yourself a cookie because I've got none to spare. Sound effects are alright, they sound like what they should, and there's a couple of grunts here and there that sound particularly grunty, and that's really all I've got to say about that, really. Well, you have to start somewhere, and WCW vs. nWo World Tour does a fine enough job of establishing a foundation of wrestling gameplay for future iterations to build and improve upon. The actual game itself is not the most exciting game of the bunch. You only have a handful of familiar wrestlers among no-name imitators, and the feature set is quite shallow, but at the end of the day, the gameplay is the real highlight and holds up rather well, which makes World Tour a perfectly acceptable representation of perfectly acceptable professional wrestling. It's a fairly common game, pretty cheap as well, and well worth checking out even if you've already played the follow-ups, and if you can, I guess go for that virtual pro wrestling thing because it has more stuff, I guess. If nothing else, it's mildly amusing to play a game where a no-name jobber like Sumo Joe could go over a big-time star like Hollywood Hogan, whether it worked for him or not, brother.